Imagine a legendary psychologist, the brilliant, composed Carl Jung, being drawn into a labyrinth of his own unconscious by a young patient. He thought he was the healer. Instead, he became the one being healed, manipulated, ensnared. This is the true story of Sabina Spielrein, a patient, a muse, a rival, and the woman who turned Jung's methods back on him. Zürich, August 1904. The Burghölzli psychiatric hospital hums with the new energy of modern psychiatry. Under the direction of Eugen Bleuler, young doctors experiment with word association tests, hypnosis, and the emerging theory of psychoanalysis. Into this world steps Sabina Nikolayevna Spielrein, a 19-year-old Russian Jewish woman admitted for hysteria, falling into uncontrollable fits of laughter, crying, and tics following her sister's death. Jung, 29, energetic and intellectually ambitious, takes her on as his first analytic case. Their sessions begin in October 1904 with experiments in word association and dream analysis. Sabina recovers quickly, so quickly that she remains at Burghölzli, not as a patient, but as an intern. The first sign of a bond stronger than therapist and client is already forming. In 1906, Jung writes to Freud, introducing the case, "Spielrein is the person I wrote you about. She was, of course, systematically planning my seduction, which I considered inopportune. Now she is seeking revenge." Decades later, Freud would recall that Jung first failed to see the extent of his own emotional entanglement with Sabina, and systematically planning seduction, revenge. Those words, framed in Jung's own tone, suggest a patient actively shaping the emotional terrain. By mid-1908, the power dynamic has subtly inverted. Jung, now married, continues to correspond with Sabina long after clinical treatment ends. In a letter from June 30th, 1908, he confesses, "My dear Miss Spielrein, you have managed well and truly to grasp my unconscious with your sharp letter. Such a thing could only happen to me." Jung acknowledges, unguarded, he is reacting not only intellectually, but unconsciously to her words. He meets her on the Limmat River to talk, not analyze. And yet the lines between therapy, friendship, and intellectual flirtation blur. On July 4th, 1908, he writes with poetic honesty, "I look forward to seeing you. Your thinking is bold, far-reaching, and philosophical." The doctor admires his former patient's mind, but this admiration is also a subtle confession. He finds himself under her spell. In December 1908, Jung's letters veer into both shame and awe. "My mind is torn to its very depths. Will you forgive me for being as I am? I am one of the weakest and most unstable of human beings. I fear for my work, my life's task. How shall I free myself from all these questions?" He continues, "I am looking for someone who understands how to love without punishing, imprisoning, or sucking him dry. I seek love at its purest, not as means to an end." Notice the layers here. Jung is profoundly exposed, vulnerable, distraught, yet he frames it in terms of seeking an ideal, spiritual love. It's not a breakdown, it's a philosophical surrender to something or someone beyond him. He continues, "It is my misfortune that I cannot live without the joy of love, of tempestuous, ever-changing love. This demon stands as an unholy contradiction to my compassion and sensitivity." That word, demon, carries eerie resonance. Love as inner demon. It's the language of possession, and where did he learn it? From her? In response to her? This is no typical therapeutic exchange. Jung confesses to being pulled into emotional storms. Sabina's influence has reconfigured his psyche. The patient has become teacher. Healer becomes healed. So far we see a reversal of roles. Jung begins to listen and respond to her unconscious, not merely interpret hers. A merging of boundaries. He meets her socially, she graduates from patient to colleague, they correspond as equals. Manipulative brilliance? She writes with intellectual precision, touching his hidden zones, his demon, his fragility, his desire. This isn't clinical oversight, it's psychological intensity. And it sets the stage for the deeper twist, Sabina writing her own theory of destruction and creation, a theory Jung would later echo, yet fail to credit her for. By 1911, Sabina Spielrein was no longer a patient. She had transformed herself into something more dangerous, more potent, a psychoanalyst in her own right, a mind sharp enough to reshape Jung's intellectual world from within. After leaving Burghölzli, she studied medicine in Zürich, wrote papers on psychoanalysis, and maintained correspondence with both Jung and Freud. But behind the formal academic discourse, something subtler was happening. Sabina's ideas were beginning to infiltrate Jung's own thinking, almost as if she had planted seeds inside his psyche during their most intimate exchanges. In August 1911, Spielrein submitted a paper titled Destruction as the Cause of Coming into Being to the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, a radical, unsettling meditation on the intimate relationship between destruction and creativity, death and life. She proposed that the sexual instinct was inherently ambivalent. It contained both the desire to unite and the compulsion to destroy, dissolve, disintegrate. Her words were uncanny and prescient. This was not merely a theory, it was a reflection of their relationship itself, a shadow play of their own entangled psyches. She wrote, "The goal of sexuality is not merely reproduction, but the destruction of the individual's boundaries and immersion into a greater whole. It seeks to overcome separation through the dissolution of the self." This was decades before Freud's formal articulation of the death drive, and yet here was Spielrein, outlining a paradox that eerily mirrored both her feelings toward Jung and Jung's feelings toward her. Love as a desire to dissolve, to annihilate oneself in the beloved, to let destruction itself be creative. Not long after Sabina's paper circulated, Jung's writings began to echo her language and motifs. His concept of the anima, the inner feminine image in the male psyche, bears striking resemblance to Spielrein's own descriptions of psychological fusion, death, and rebirth through union with the feminine. It is as if Sabina had implanted a psychic idea into Jung, a Trojan horse hidden within the very relationship that had begun as patient and doctor. In one letter, Jung even acknowledges how profoundly her intellect shaped his thinking. "My dearest Sabina, you are right that I often treat ideas which belong to you as though they were my own. This is not mere forgetfulness, but the confusion of two souls who have so completely merged." He does not deny it, he confesses it. The boundary between his work and her influence was dissolving exactly as she described in her paper, a destruction of separateness leading to something new. At this point, Sabina was writing to both Freud and Jung, intellectually positioned between the two titans of early psychoanalysis, negotiating her place and her ideas. And yet, history has largely erased her role, framing her as a tragic patient rather than a powerful thinker. What's chilling is that Jung himself seemed aware of this eerie inversion. In another letter from early 1912, he wrote, "You bewitched me. You grasped in your weakness what I could not see in my strength." There, buried in the language of romantic regret, is an admission. She understood something before he did. She grasped a truth that he, in his intellectual pride, could not see. This theme repeats, Sabina as the unconscious guide, leading Jung deeper into his own anima, his own shadow, his own death instinct, while history continued to call her merely his patient. Spielrein's paper, Destruction as the Cause of Coming into Being, contains passages that could easily double as veiled commentary on her relationship with Jung. There is something in the very nature of love that tends toward its own destruction. The closer two souls draw together, the more powerful the instinct to dissolve entirely, to obliterate boundaries. In those words, we see not merely theory, but the eerie dynamic that played out between them, an emotional entanglement where Jung thought he was in control, but was slowly being shaped, undone, and transformed by Sabina's intellect, presence, and vulnerability. In a letter to Freud, Jung would later describe the aftermath of this relationship. "I was in danger of losing myself. The patient became the analyst." That haunting confession could have been the epigraph of their entire relationship. Let's pause here to reflect on what's unfolding psychologically. Jung begins by treating Sabina as a case of hysteria, applying word association tests, interpreting her dreams. But through their shared intellectual and emotional entanglement, Sabina evolves into something far more potent, She becomes the archetype of the anima itself, the very figure that would dominate Jung's later psychological explorations. Her 1911 paper becomes an intellectual roadmap for Jung's evolving theories, the tension between destruction and creation, the dissolution of self into relationship, the integration of shadow. This was not a patient passively receiving treatment. Sabina was actively rewriting Jung's inner world. Whether consciously manipulative or driven by her own unconscious genius, Sabina Spielrein did what no other patient ever did. She reached into Jung's psyche and permanently altered the foundations of his thought. By 1912, Sabina Spielrein had moved on from Zürich. She was building her own career as a psychoanalyst and later returned to Russia, where she would work in Moscow and Rostov-on-Don, establishing child psychology clinics and writing psychoanalytic essays. And yet, despite her accomplishments, a shadow hung over her legacy. A shadow cast by her entanglement with Jung. Jung himself never formally acknowledged how much her ideas shaped his most important concepts. His notion of the anima, the feminine image inside every man's psyche, owes a chilling debt to Spielrein. Her image, her presence, her vulnerability, her philosophical insight, these all formed a living template for what Jung would later describe as the archetype of the anima. Her paper on destruction and creation? Echoes of it would surface throughout Jung's writings, especially in his exploration of the shadow, the integration of opposites, and the tension of contraries at the heart of individuation. But Sabina Spielrein, as a name, slowly vanished from the record. In the official histories of psychology and psychoanalysis, she was remembered primarily as a patient, perhaps a tragic muse, or at best, a woman entangled between Jung and Freud. Her intellectual legacy was buried, her ideas subsumed and rebranded by the very men she had challenged, influenced, and, in a haunting reversal, manipulated. Jung's later writings bear unmistakable signs of Sabina's influence. His concept of individuation, the psychological process by which a person integrates unconscious content to become a whole self, is steeped in motifs that mirror Spielrein's writings. Jung wrote in Symbols of Transformation, 1912, a text that marks his break with Freud and his emergence as an independent thinker. The transformation process is always preceded by a death, the death of the ego, the dissolution of the previous form, so that a new totality can be born. Death, destruction, transformation, rebirth. These were precisely the ideas that Spielrein had articulated in her 1911 paper, ideas Jung was reading, absorbing, and echoing even as he distanced himself publicly from their personal entanglement. What's eerie is that Spielrein's paper was not only a psychoanalytic theory, it was a mirror of their relationship itself. Their connection was an experiment in destruction and rebirth, a dissolving of boundaries, a rupture in Jung's professional composure that led to his psychic transformation. Even after their relationship formally ended, Jung's writings suggest he continued to wrestle with the ghost of Sabina Spielrein. In a later reflection, Jung confided, "No analysis is complete without the analyst's own unconscious being drawn in. The patient can always find the analyst's weak spot." And isn't this exactly what had happened with Sabina? She had found his weak spot, the anima, before he had even fully conceptualized it. She had shown him what it meant to be vulnerable to one's unconscious desires and projections. Jung once wrote in his correspondence with Freud, "Spielrein's revenge has been terrible. She has influenced my soul's depths, where all is chaos and uncertainty." That phrase, "where all is chaos and uncertainty," reveals Jung's eerie awareness that he had never fully escaped her shadow. Sabina Spielrein's life ended in tragedy almost beyond comprehension. In 1942, as Nazi forces swept into Rostov-on-Don during Operation Barbarossa, she and her 2 young daughters were rounded up in a massacre and shot in a mass grave simply for being Jewish. Her voice was extinguished, not only from life but from history itself. For decades, Spielrein's name was absent from the official narratives of psychoanalysis. The woman who once manipulated Carl Jung, who influenced some of the most important ideas in 20th century psychology, had become a ghost, an eerie absence haunting the field she helped to build. Her erasure itself became a symbol, the destruction of the feminine, the loss of intellectual agency, and the obliteration of boundaries that she so brilliantly theorized but could not ultimately escape. At this point, the psychological tragedy comes full circle. Sabina Spielrein, the patient who manipulated Carl Jung, became not only a real-life figure but also a psychological archetype within his theories. Her insights into destruction and rebirth were absorbed by Jung, transformed into universal psychological principles, but without her name attached. The relationship that began in treatment ended in intellectual erasure, a haunting metaphor for the very dynamic she exposed. And yet, from a certain angle, Sabina Spielrein's influence endures precisely because it is buried and unconscious. Her ideas, destruction, dissolution, transformation, became core elements of Jungian psychology. Even Jung's notion that every analyst must encounter their anima, their shadow, their unconscious vulnerability, is arguably a lesson he learned first from Sabina Spielrein herself. In this sense, Sabina still manipulates Jung. Every time his ideas are read, taught, analyzed, there, in the shadows, is Sabina's ghost, whispering about the intertwining of love and destruction, the dangerous proximity between healer and healed. Picture this: a 29-year-old Carl Jung, brilliant, ambitious, but still searching for his voice, encounters a 19-year-old Sabina Spielrein, a woman in crisis, a patient, someone society expected him to heal and control. But control was the very thing that began slipping through his fingers. Over time, their doctor-patient relationship became something darker, more entangled. The distance between analyst and analyzed dissolved. Sabina stopped being an object of study and became an agent of transformation, not only recovering from her own wounds, but uncovering Jung's most hidden vulnerabilities, stirring his deepest unconscious forces into motion. And then, almost imperceptibly, she began shaping his mind itself. Her writing on destruction as the cause of coming into being was more than a theory. It was a prophecy of what she would do to him, breaking his defenses, dissolving the safe categories he imposed between self and other, theory and passion, man and woman. She showed him what it meant to face one's shadow, not just clinically, but personally, intimately. It was as if Sabina Spielrein became the anima figure he would later immortalize in his theories, the guide, the ghost, the patient, who manipulated not only his mind, but his entire intellectual destiny. In the very act of treating her, Jung himself became treated. In trying to heal her, he was made to confront his own unconscious, and Sabina, whether consciously or not, guided him into the terrain that would define his entire intellectual life. His most enduring concepts, the anima, the death-rebirth cycle of individuation, the tension of opposites, are soaked in the echoes of Spielrein's presence. They are inseparable from her influence. And yet, as time passed, her name disappeared. Her image faded from public accounts of psychoanalysis. The patient who had outthought, outfelt, and outmaneuvered her own analyst became little more than a tragic footnote, a rumor, a shadow. Sabina's own fate, murdered in a mass execution in Rostov-on-Don, buried in an unmarked grave, became a bitter, symbolic echo of her intellectual fate as well. She was silenced by history, by war, by the very intellectual establishment she helped shape. The patient who manipulated Jung did not simply disappear, she was annihilated, and the world quietly let her vanish from the story of psychology. And yet, her ghost remained, embedded in Jung's concepts, lurking in the anima archetype itself, hidden in plain sight. In the end, there is something deeply uncanny about Sabina Spielrein's story. Her entire life reflects the very principle she discovered, that destruction is the cause of coming into being. Her relationship with Jung destroyed his clinical detachment and gave birth to his most famous theories. Her intellectual legacy was erased and then rediscovered decades later, forcing modern scholars to confront the uncomfortable truth that one of Jung's greatest influences was not a mentor, not a colleague, but a patient, a young woman he tried to treat but who ended up treating him. Even Jung himself seemed haunted by her absence. Long after her death, he would write, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." But what he never explicitly said was this: in his meeting with Sabina Spielrein, it was he who was transformed most. So the next time you hear Jung's name, his brilliant theories about the unconscious, the anima, individuation, the shadow. Remember, behind that towering figure of psychology was a patient who became a theorist who became an uncredited influence, a forgotten genius whose shadow still lingers in the very fabric of Jungian psychology today. Her name was Sabina Spielrein, the patient who manipulated Carl Jung, the patient who haunted him, and the patient who, even now, whispers from the depths of psychology's collective unconscious. Long after Sabina Spielrein's name was forgotten, long after her grave went unmarked and her papers disappeared into dusty archives, something strange remained, her presence inside Jung's psychology. Even as Jung matured into the elder statesman of analytical psychology, he kept returning to the same themes that Sabina Spielrein had first articulated: the union of opposites, the paradoxical embrace of destruction and creation, the surrender to forces deeper than conscious control. His famous Red Book, a record of his own visionary descent into the unconscious, written between 1913 and 1917, reads almost like a belated confession that the analyst himself had become the patient, led by an inner guide, haunted by shadows, manipulated by forces he could neither master nor fully understand. And here's what's chilling. The anima figure who dominates the Red Book's visions is not a cold theoretical abstraction. She is alive, unpredictable, seducing, deceiving, guiding Jung into deeper psychological waters, and many scholars today see in this anima a spectral trace of Sabina Spielrein herself. She was gone from his life, erased from psychoanalytic history, but she had become part of his inner architecture. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung describes the anima as a personification of all feminine psychological tendencies in a man's psyche. She appears as a guide into the unconscious, a mediator between ego and soul. She is both the source of inspiration and the cause of emotional chaos. These words read like a poetic description of Sabina's precise role in Jung's life. She had been his real anima encounter, living, breathing, intellectually brilliant, emotionally chaotic, deeply transformative, and she left her imprint on his very definition of this archetype. It wasn't theoretical, it was personal. Her presence infused the very language Jung used for decades afterward. She became the original shadow woman in his intellectual and emotional landscape. When Jung said that the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances, it was no empty metaphor. In their case, something irreversible happened. Both were transformed. Spielrein moved from patient to analyst, theorist, independent thinker, but remained haunted by her relationship with Jung, revisiting it in her papers, folding their history into her theories. Jung moved from detached analyst to wounded man, exposed to his unconscious through Spielrein's emotional intensity, forced to integrate chaos into his life's work. This was the ultimate psychological inversion. The healer healed and wounded by his patient. And here's the final irony that makes this story so haunting. The manipulation was not overt, aggressive, or conscious. It was subtle, symbolic, archetypal. Sabina Spielrein didn't manipulate Jung in the petty sense of the word. She embodied a force that drew him into confrontation with his own anima, shadow, eros, and vulnerability. She didn't just manipulate the man. She manipulated his ideas, his worldview, his psyche. And that's why her influence is so enduring, because it became invisible. Her manipulation succeeded so completely that her presence disappeared into the very architecture of Jung's psychology. Her theories lived on, but under his name, under his language. This is why Sabina's story resonates today, not as a simple cautionary tale about crossing boundaries, but as a deeper warning about how power, intellect, and intimacy dissolve into each other when the unconscious is involved. What if the deepest influence we exert on others is the influence they never recognize? What if the greatest manipulator is not the one who commands, but the one who dissolves boundaries, blurs identities, and quietly reprograms another person's very way of seeing the world? That is the true power of Sabina Spielrein's legacy. The patient who manipulated Carl Jung was not merely a historical footnote. She was a force of nature, a living archetype, an anima incarnate who stepped straight out of Jung's unconscious before he had even theorized her existence, and rewrote his intellectual destiny from within, And though her name was erased for decades, though her grave remained unmarked, her ghost continues to haunt psychology itself. In every modern exploration of the anima, the shadow, and the unconscious, in every encounter between analyst and analyse and where emotions blur and boundaries collapse, in every philosophical meditation on destruction as the seed of rebirth, Sabina Spielrein is there, not as a footnote, but as the patient who never left.